Hello? Oh, hello everybody. Hello, welcome. Welcome everybody to the belated but much anticipated launch of Growing Up Human by Brenna Hassett. Before we start proceedings, you're going to be welcomed to this wonderful venue by Banu, who can't be here tonight but has sent us a video that's going to play. Please give it your attention before we move on to Brenna's stuff.
Hello everyone, welcome to Newington Green Meeting House. My name is Banu Aydunoğlu-Gil. I'm the Heritage Program Manager at the Meeting House. Our Heritage Program includes various events, exhibitions, talks, etc. around the themes of social justice, equality, feminism, etc. And this legacy is founded by the 17th and 18th century dissenters, as well as great intellectuals of the early 19th century, such as one of the first ministers, Richard Price, founder of the Western feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Anna Letitia Barbauld. And we are very proud and pleased to be hosting my dear friend, Dr. Brenna Hassett's book launch, Growing Up Humans, tonight. Brenna did amazing things in the last couple of years, especially, and continue doing so, as you can see. And also accompanying her amazing TrowelBlazers, Rebecca and Victoria. So you're in the right place. I hope you enjoy the talk and the panel discussion, and we would like to see you more at the Meeting House in the future. Thank you.
Yes, as Banu points out, it's Brenna's night, but I have to say, we are pretty excited here on stage. Me, Victoria Herridge, Rebecca Wragg Sykes, Becky over there, and Brenna, to be here together, because we are very rarely in the same room. And we would only be slightly happier, I think, if we had Susie, Pilar Birch with us too. So between the four of us, we run a site called TrowelBlazers. Check it out if you have not already. It is a site that celebrates the contribution of women to archaeology, paleontology, and geology. And we think it's pretty special. But the most special thing about it was that it allowed us to forge an incredible friendship. We only actually met on the internet. I think it's like, God, how many years ago? Is it like 10 years ago we met. And then since then, we have become firm friends. And it is amazing what happens when you meet like-minded people who have zero ego and also happen to be exceptionally talented, like Brenna here and Rebecca over there. So you're in the presence of two remarkable trailblazers in archaeology who are not just top archaeologists, but also amazing writers. So Becky's here partly to be the Neanderthal foil to Brenna's Homo sapiens. So, did you hear that? You can't do jokes without a microphone, Brenna.
I was just going to say that, unfortunately, Becky's side lost. So.
And I think that, for me, is one of the most interesting things about Brenna's book, is that she talks about growing up human, and of course we immediately start by thinking about ourselves, but it's a topic and a question that is much broader than that. And if you've read the book, you may be mistaken for wondering, when are the humans coming into this? Because it starts off, I'd say, at least the first 5 chapters being mostly about primates, more broadly, giraffes, pizza rat. And so I think to set us all off, and to set the scene, for those of you who haven't read the book, Brenna, would you mind starting by reading, I've chosen this for you, the paragraph marked with the first bookmark, please?
Okay. This will come as no surprise to those of you who have opened the book, which is probably about 2% of you. But you are weird. Your baby is weird, and you were weird as a baby. And after that, you just got weirder. And that is for reasons that include planetary domination, but also a long tail of penis spikes and hidden ovulation and fertile fat and monogamy and unripe and unready babies, the evolution of dads and the secret purpose of grandmas, and some very, very strange parenting practices, ancient and modern, that make us the miracle that we are, the ape that never grew up. And I do mean that in the nicest possible way, but you are all very weird. I think I'm instructed to read something. Oh, I'm not.
Not yet, Brenna. Not yet. That's for the end. Good. But you say that. You say, we are weird, and we were weird as babies, and there's some weird parenting practices. But just how weird are we? I mean, how weird are our babies?
Well, extraordinarily, because for one thing, they stay babies for just about ever. So anyone who is currently asking their parents for financial assistance or has gone through what I like to call an urban childhood, which is that 10 extra years you spend definitely promising you're getting a career, definitely, but could you cover my rent maybe just this month? But humans actually biologically are weird. We have a childhood that lasts something like 25 years to become physically adult, and maybe a decade or two after that to really get the emotional and social skills. But, I mean...
If ever.
So, 25 years out of a lifespan of 80, the other animals on this earth that have a 25-year childhood are whales that live to almost 300 years. We don't live to 300 years. We've chosen somehow evolutionarily to take those goalposts of how much time we spend pretty useless, and we've stretched them as far as they will possibly go, and that is what makes us weird. And it comes out in a lot of different ways.
So, if you pass that over to Becky, Brenna, when you say us, do you mean us as Homo sapiens? Is there something you can say about Neanderthal babies that gives insight to what Brenna is saying? I mean, is it Homo sapiens, our species, that is weird, or is it bigger than that?
Well, I guess I would say Neanderthals are really close to us. You know, like a lot of the context in this book, and I think this is a really great book because it isn't just about like Homo sapiens. It puts us in the context in terms of the primate biology and evolution more broadly, and that's actually what you really need to understand why it's all totally strange. But in that picture, Neanderthals are very close to us, so I think we should expect them to be almost as weird in quite a lot of ways. But I don't know, if you ask me like about Neanderthal babies or children, like I guess what jumps out most is we don't know that much about them, but we do know that the very smallest of them seem to have been buried with care, actually, compared to sort of the broader span of burial data. Overall, we have more very young babies and infants for Neanderthal burials than we do for Upper Paleolithic Ice Age Homo sapiens people, so I find that quite interesting. That's
I mean, what do you think, Brenna? I mean, when would you hazard, like, give us a guess when you think human, if you take human to be everything that's a bit like us, but when did human babies first get weird?
It starts with the tree shrew thing. So, millions of years ago, there was a thing that was a little bit like a tree shrew. That's what the sort of origin of primates is. It's something that's not a bat, but quite close to a bat, it just doesn't have wings. And that little animal started investing in its offspring, and the entire primate clade has just been a story of putting more and more investment into its babies. of coming up with strategies for caring for them, for feeding them, for providing for them, that goes above and beyond even what the rest of mammals, who admittedly are already devoted parents, they invented that whole milk thing. You know, that's already a level of devotion. But primates really have taken it to the next level. And the thing that primates do with this extended childhood, which I think is sort of the point, is they use it for learning how to be a better primate. That longer period seems to give them a chance to basically gain an advantage. We see it in some other species, like crows that are incredibly social. Crows have a very long juvenile period because crow society is technically murderous. And it needs, you know, some navigating. So crows actually have a very long juvenile period because they need to learn the rules of the road. And primates seem to have taken that to just an extreme level and needed to learn the skills it takes to be a primate in a, well, possibly also murderous primate society.
Yeah, so you get this kind of like, you know, this situation, you've got these clever primates, of which we're one, and you have these already long childhoods, and then you start to see this evidence in the archaeological record of that period becoming longer and longer and longer. Do you think that childhood has been the same throughout most of human history? I mean, is there any one childhood?
I mean, I've got strong opinions, and we're sitting here in a good dissenter church. So I think we can talk about, I think probably in terms of a lengthening period of childhood, that's several species sort of, it's still very controversial. There is some argument that Neanderthal children grew slightly quicker. That's not actually written in stone, but that would, yeah, or written in enamel.
Yeah, just rubbish jokes, not written in teeth.
They're not rubbish jokes if they're about teeth. But, you know, that from critters, people, like Homo erectus, we do see, you know, evidence of, you know, what is a quite ape-like growth pattern written in the bones and teeth, slowly extending. I mean, that's 2.5 million years to get from, you know, ape childhood might be, let's say, 12-ish years for something the same body size as us, getting to about the same size. And we've doubled that. But we've doubled that in probably the last, definitely the last million years, getting to our modern sort of human growth. And so we must have been extending for some time, but it is quite likely that we have invented lots of fun, exciting social ways of having very different childhoods. I think everyone could probably look at, you know, the world around them and say there are very, very different ways of being a child. If you are a schoolgirl in Afghanistan versus, you know, a schoolgirl in, well, Newington Green, there are probably very different life experiences ahead of you. And so those are, of course, humans doing what they do best, which is to take their culture and turn it into something that evolution just has to deal with. And I think that is something that you could probably go around pointing fingers at when we got the ability to invest more in children, in some children, and less in others. So you could probably look at when human societies got less equal in their overall investment and say that's when childhood really started to be different for different people.
Yeah, I think, like, obviously I'm going to bring it back to Neanderthals. I guess what we can see, like, biologically, like you're saying, there is a chance that maybe they grew very slightly faster, but like not gigantically faster. So they still would have had, you know, like if you have a 7-year-old, developmentally pretty similar to 7-year-olds, you know, that we see now. Maybe as you get towards teenage years, you might have very, very slightly precocious, but not much, I don't think. But in terms of like how they actually like experienced being young, there are tiny little hints that we can see from that. And again, it comes back to teeth. Teeth are awesome, they do so much. But no, so we can see, first of all, that some young, early Neanderthals, I think these ones are from Spanish site Atapuerca, so it's about 430,000 years ago. They were quite intense tooth wear. So like 3 to 5 year olds. So whatever, and when I say tooth wear, I mean like not from what they're eating, but they're using their mouths as like a third hand or a processing thing to probably like soften up skins or other things like this. But even very young individuals have got quite heavy wear already. But then you have this sort of nuance to that, where there was another study done in a much younger Neanderthal site from a different Spanish site. And this was a boy who's probably about 9, and he has scratches on his teeth from using a stone tool to cut the food in his mouth. So they hold it in their mouth and then they slice it. So he's already doing, eating like a grown-up, but he doesn't have other kinds of scratches, which is from, again, a different way of using your mouth like a tool. So he's kind of learned how to be grown up in one way, but he's not taking on the full range of sort of adult tasks and activities. So there does seem to be like a different stages of childhood there. So that's pretty amazing that we can see that.
Yeah, I think that's something. So traditionally, if you were a studier of primates, and particularly of primate teeth, which of course everyone wants to be, but not everyone gets the chance, there is a sort of rule of thumb, and it breaks down when it comes to modern humans, Neanderthals, we think. But the idea is that your molars, so the big chunky chewing teeth in the back of your mouth, they actually have a pretty set, arrive at a pretty set time that your first molar will show up at the end of weaning, when you're sort of done with breast milk, when you're ready to eat some solid food. The second one will show up when you're sort of able to forage by yourself, when you're sort of more or less able to you could find stuff to eat, you would manage. And then third one is usually associated with sexual maturity. So that's the wisdom teeth, which of course we now hate for other evolutionary reasons that involve what we eat. And you can read my first book for more on that. But so this is a really standard, biology function. This is what your teeth are built for. It all goes together. And we, of course, do nothing like that. You get your second molar, adult molar, baby teeth don't count, your adult molar, and, you look at that child, it's like, well, that child cannot make a pasta. That child could not make a ragu if its life depended on it. Geez, I mean, these are, so we have culturally moved away, and we've certainly moved away very particularly from the association between weaning, the cessation of breastfeeding, and that first molar. That is no longer applicable. We've decided that it is much easier to get calories into the baby by providing them a Sainsbury's ragu.
You say we, Brenna, but you say, well, my child's 15. No, it's not. But you say we, but you're talking about a particular culture in a particular place in the world, right? I mean, there must be cultures still where it's not too distinct. When did your first adult molar come through? It's at 12, isn't it?
No.
When is it then?
It's I think the first adult molar is like something more like 4 or 5.
Oh, well, that's fine then. No, okay, it's fine.
No,
there's plenty of cultures that would breastfeed till 4 or 5.
Weirdly, not a lot of them.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
so the longest extended breastfeeding that's sort of ethnographically recorded is 7 years old, and that's in an extreme climate. That's very far Arctic, where it's even then acknowledged as a sort of emergency sort of measure. But most human cultures do cease breastfeeding quite early, and it changes depending on what you do for a living. So agricultural people who make their living mostly through farming and agricultural things, usually about 2 years would be the standard pre-modern, pre-industrialized workforce where you have to go sit in a broom closet. That would be the standard, and then 4 years would be possibly the extent of things if you were forager, if you were sort of hunting and gathering, let's say, not using a lot of farmed foods, if you were pretty mobile. But generally, I think the statistic in the UK is less than 1% of women exclusively breastfeed for 6 months, which is just about the sort of minimum limit that the WHO thinks is okay. But it is possible, of course, to extend for a very long time. And of course, our species has a remarkable history of extending that for money. I mean, that's we actually market wet nursing. So
that's a really interesting thing you mention in your book, and I think it's the idea of what the children do versus what the adults do, and how humans mess around with that, right? So children may be weaned, but the breast milk can keep on going, right? So that's the idea, and how you then take different strategies to play with that. Can you expand a bit? What is the archaeological history of wet nursing?
It's really interesting. So of course, my background is I am technically an anthropologist, but I do a lot of archaeology for all that. So my interest is sort of split between everything involving, how long do primates breastfeed for? Why are orangutans, still on the boob at 7 years? I mean, no wonder they hang out alone. It's just like, it's a very demanding life being an orangutan. It just doesn't sound very nice. It sounds very difficult. But and then you have the kind of archaeology side, which is really interesting because we have this long history of humans who are apparently terrible at breastfeeding. And we really are. And we have, 3,000-year-old baby bottles. And you can sort of XRF the insides and see that they've got lipids in them from animal fats. They were, feeding babies milk. And of course, you find these in graves with small children. So, I mean, it was not always a successful policy, but we've been substituting animal milk for as long as we've been able to get animal milk. And we know that we've been paying other people to substitute milk. We have I think the first wet nurse contract is about 5,000, it's a little less than 5,000 years old from Mesopotamia, written in cuneiform, how much you have to pay. There's a quite shrieky sort of mother-in-law letter that comes to us from the Greek period in Egypt, where a mother has written to, I think her son, going, well, no grandchild, no daughter, or her son-in-law, and said, my daughter is definitely not breastfeeding. You need to pay for a wet nurse. This is unacceptable. It's not clear that it was written in green ink. It's now gone black on the papyrus, but it is very close. So this is what humans do, though, is that we have created cultural obstacles to having a sort of childhood where everyone sort of more or less needs the same thing because they're going to grow up. And we've created cultural obstacles to that, but then we've created cultural solutions. So I think when I said earlier that childhood became different for different kinds of people, I mean, you really do see that. You see that in the way children play. You see that in the way that children adopt gender roles in their play. They start having gendered play. People looking at play among kids whose parents mostly forage, so they're going to grow up to be foragers, probably. And other kids who their parents grew up to be farmers, very similar sort of region of the world. And the kids are going to be farmers. They pick up gender roles much earlier because gendered roles are very important in their society. They dictate what they're going to do to a greater extent. And so you have our culture as a sort of constantly reinforcing, button for getting over our evolutionary hurdles, but it sort of causes all the problems in the first place.
Do you see any of that sort of paralleled in, say, chimpanzee children, and sort of as a kind of basis for the aspect of anything? What is a chimpanzee childhood like versus, say, a modern human's?
Also murderous. Chimpanzees are so mean. I don't know why people are so okay. But chimpanzees are. Everyone knows what a chimpanzee is. And then there's also bonobos. Bonobos look very like chimpanzees, but they are utterly different, like 2 million years different. And they have extremely different cultures. So bonobos have a lot of cooperative activity. Chimpanzees are a little bit more territorial, more aggressive. There's sort of more of a male aggressive role. And chimpanzees, particularly, have quite gendered learning patterns. They have chimpanzee daughters learn how to hunt from their mothers. So if you ever want to know who developed weapons, it's ladies. They hunt tiny, cute monkeys because chimpanzees are evil. But sorry, chimpanzees. But the ones that actually hunt with spears are females. And that's something that's learned by the daughters, so that's transmitted. And the same with the sort of termite fishing. Have you ever seen the sort of video of a chimpanzee putting a piece of grass in to get yummy termites out to eat? Female chimpanzees, their daughters, will sit around longer paying attention to how to do that, and they will learn how to do it from their mothers, whereas the boys tend to like, oh yeah, whatever. And they have, and both sort of primate societies have ideas about play as well. So in chimpanzees, the kind of really active play happens very young, and then is rapidly sort of quashed. So adults don't really play. They don't really initiate play and sort of go teasing their friends, probably because they've all got spears and killing on their mind. I'm really horrible about chimpanzees. But bonobos, they play as kids, but they actually have an extended period of play in adolescence. They really do play more as adults as well. So there's sort of cultures of being a child that, we can see in other species, not even our own. It'd be fascinating to know what Neanderthal.
Well, yeah. How do you find play in the archaeological record?
Very, very hard. Just because something's small doesn't make it a toy, basically, is the answer to that question. Yeah, it's extremely difficult. You can get, we always assume toys are like miniaturized versions of stuff, because that's kind of what we see in a lot of our material culture. And probably that happened to some extent. For example, you might get sized down tools, but you can also get tools that are small for lots of different reasons, because if you have small stone tools, they just get smaller because you resharpen them like a pencil. So there's lots of methodological issues about how you actually identify this. But also, and this is a point Brenna makes in the book, kids are amazing. They can play with anything. They don't need to have a toy. They just play with the world. The world is the playground. So undoubtedly they were doing stuff all over the place. And this is actually an argument I've had with people sort of on Twitter. How sad is that? But archaeologists on Twitter, one of the things that we might complain about to each other is how do you know the spatial patterns? Say you have a cave and you excavate your cave and you've got hearth and, I don't know, some scatters of stone tools and some bones. How do you know that all of that material has not been messed about with by loads of 3-year-olds? You don't. If you go around anyone's house with young kids, hellhole. And we assume that caves are reflecting spatial activity areas. Well, yeah, but whose activity? So, of course, there are real spatial things, and we can pick this out from caves, but kids were there. So undoubtedly a lot of what we see in the sites we excavate, that is their presence, but we can't pick that out very, very easily. But one thing I do like imagining for Neanderthals and for earlier hominins, actually, to come back to the weaning and the end of childhood, some of the stuff that makes me laugh most is ethnographic accounts from hunter-gatherers, where it's a big trauma when a new baby arrives and the breastfeeding has to be shared. But not only that, in some hunting-gathering cultures where they're living in tropical jungles and you don't put your child down on the ground because there's a lot of insects, actually the more traumatic thing is that they stop being carried, and it's the new baby is the one that's carried and they're on the ground. Oh, tantrums, big tantrums.
We've all been there. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how early was the first tantrum when you were not actually being carried in your nice little leather wrap anymore on mummy, or daddy.
But that, I think what you pinpoint there is how do we ever extricate our own ideas of what is normal for childhood, for babyhood, for adulthood? How do we ever extricate those from our interpretations of other cultures, be they present or past? And how do we even get at what is human childhood? What is growing up human if it's so very variable? Can you actually, I'm going to put you on the spot, Brenna, can you define it? Can you define what it means to be a human child?
Well, I think I would start by occasionally asking a lady. Because and that was one of my ulterior motives in gathering this collection of lovely people on the stage, is we exactly as Tori says, we have had a terrible time imagining childhood. For one thing, we mostly didn't, because it's not nearly as interesting as competitive mating. If you happen to be a certain type of man in a certain type of anthropology department in 1920, there could be nothing more interesting than competitive primate mating. Everything else in evolution just pales in comparison. Why would you care? Yeah, some babies probably come of it. But did you see the size of the on that guy? That followed, by the way, in the sort of 1950s when they started getting really into measuring primate genitalia again and working out whether that meant they were monogamous or not. One imagines that was very fun dinner table conversations with the wife at home. But, you know, at some point, people...
Sorry, I'm just remembering some tutorials. It wasn't the 1950s, it was still going on in the late 1990s. Anyway.
Oh, yes, no, careers were made. There's a very famous diagram, I'm sure you've seen it, anyway. But the diagram of relative testes size is a standard anthropological tool. It is apparently very important. But I mean, the shock really came when in the 1970s somebody asked a woman what they thought about primate evolution. And they're like, yeah, you know, I don't think the lady chimpanzee likes being bothered. It's like, this was a shock. This is a surprise. This is what, it had not occurred to anyone that this would be important. And I think, actually, you know, our understanding of what childhood is has been so altered by having kind of pioneering women scientists actually sit there and go, you know, there are some other questions. So I think in the book I talk a lot about Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, who did a very fascinating study about infanticide in India and in monkeys. And, you know, and there are perspectives that did not come out into our field about things like female mating choice, how that might have actually existed. That, you know, that for every fascinating detail of penis spikes, there would be a, you know, reflected phenomenon in the female, and that things like child rearing and the time spent in child rearing could actually be sort of considered in our large question. The thing that always got me was it became the fad in the 60s to count every minute of activity, to work out how people spent their day living traditional lifestyles. So people followed the Khoisan, who are very famous for doing this persistence hunting. The Bushman would be the pejorative name, people might know. But the Khoisan sort of, they do a lot of hunting. So someone went out, spent all his time with them, learned to do persistence hunting, and he kept minute-by-minute records of every activity the men did. And this is where the myth of the affluent society came from, the original affluent society. So he decided that actually the men had a completely lovely life. They only worked about 16 hours a day. And then meanwhile, there's like 3 chicks back there just going, dude, I have all these tubers. Do you know how annoying it is to dig tubers? Like, and it's just one of those things that it's just, our perspective is so warped. We really cannot ever see anything outside of our social lens, but we can be aware of our social lens. And I think that's the point we are now, that we can't say exactly what childhood is like, because every time I hear about a 3-year-old walking through a lithic scatter, I'm going to be like, oh God, that would be so terrible. And, you know, I'm going to take my own experience of toddlers and sharp objects and just apply it. But, you know, I think we do try, and, you know, if you're going to grow up human today, I think the one thing you can say is that you're going to take a very, very, very long time about it.
Yes. And your hands up in the room who thinks they've grown up. Just one. Well done, David. At the back there. Well, actually, isn't it, the idea of having this exceptionally long childhood, who calls time on it, right? So when do you grow up? When do you define adulthood?
So I got a little bit of press for this, but I did flippantly say at the launch of the book, Reagan, you saw this, that if you're in a nice little comfortable Western urban world and you're a happy little middle class with your extended education, your very extended PhD, 40 sounds pretty good. This whole book is basically an anecdote that I was hoping to send to my dad in case I needed to move into the basement at the age of 40. So, this had a real purpose, this book. But I think, so for me, childhood and the entire primate strategy and our strategy, no matter how we try and disguise it, is investment. We invest physically in babies in very particular special ways with our stupid, dangerous pregnancies and our weirdly short breastfeeding. And then we invest socially, and that we do just to the nines. Like every other primate, we try and give our kids friends and rules and ways to be in their society. But we also have these, the ability to basically turn material capital into all sorts of extra investment that allows us to stay children, to stay net beneficiaries for longer. So for me, the end of childhood is when you flip from being the thing that's invested in to the thing that's doing the investing. It doesn't have to be your own kids. It's just a sort of social role. It doesn't have to be when you have your own kids. It doesn't have to be any particular sort of, physical milestone. Gray hair doesn't count. So, for me, it is, human childhood is this ridiculously long period we've given ourselves to invest in the next generation, and humans do it better than anyone else. We can invest way more than, I think, our good friends Pizza Rat and the baby giraffe from the book, and of course that weird little tree shrew that made a series of poorly calculated decisions, however many millions of years ago. But once it turns out that you are the bank of mom and dad, that's when you might be grown up.
I'm going to ask the room again then. Who here feels like a grown-up?
Hey!
I'm the only one who's being sucked dry then, clearly.
No one's going to be.
If I'm a child, I've never felt so tired and old. This is a really good point, Brenna, at this point, to get you to do my next bookmark, because I think you sum up your book really beautifully, and it's a lovely paragraph to end with before we take questions.
Now I'm allowed to read it. Right. The lesson in this book is that our childhoods have become longer from our hominid ancestors on up. And this is not a bad thing. It allows us time to learn how to be a better monkey. But we, in all our various societies, need to have a long, hard think about whether we are really giving everyone the same shot at growing up human.
Thank you. Before I take questions, I think we should give Brenna a round of applause. For not just writing a book during a pandemic, but also growing most of another baby, which is pretty awesome. Holding on there, Brenna. Keep going. But we're going to take some questions from the floor. I'm going to whiz around with this microphone so that you can be heard, and then Brenna can use that mic to answer. But I'm going to steal the first question on behalf of Susie, because Susie Pilar-Birch, she can't be here because she's in America. She sent a question for you, Brenna. She would like to know how being involved in TrowelBlazers has changed your perspective, and did it actually change the way you thought about archaeology and the questions in this book?
Since all of you had kids before me, it certainly changed my opinion on childhood. It's a miracle I had any at all, really. It's really interesting that both Becky and I have sort of written books recently, and I don't know about you, but I think particularly with this one, because I thought women's contributions to the science that's behind this book were so important, and it was just so in your face how various perspectives had been ignored and how various people were very fond of insisting things that made them feel better. There's a series of comments by a guy called Richard Trivers who has some opinions on how hot teenage girls are, which I do not recommend taking up.
Shall I read them to you?
It's the horrible footnote.
Yeah. Okay, hang on.
Not libelous, it's from his blog.
So Robert Trivers, who, if you're a student of anthropology, you would have read lots of his work. This is this is Brenna's footnote on Robert Trivers, in his own words, I guess. Robert Trivers has had an interesting career, to say the least. Having made an immensely impactful study of sexual selection in primates, he went on to the highest echelons of research and there attracted the attention of the notorious child molester Jeffrey Epstein. While repudiating Epstein's predation of underage girls, he did manage to make the statement, by the time they're 14 or 15, they're like grown women were 60 years ago. So I don't see these acts as so heinous.
He said it.
He said
also, it's not true.
So, and I think that's important. It is an important point to think. These are the people who wrote the seminal texts on which we still teach an awful lot of, not just anthropology, but also sociobiology more broadly. Anyway, there you go. Yes. I'm angry.
No, in case you're wondering, there are very, very, very few human societies where children have children as soon as they're physically capable. There's about one well-known ethnographic example, and there are absolute limits of environmental survival, and they have an infant mortality that is like 50%. It is very rare, and it is not common. Even other apes wait several years after reaching sexual maturity to have children. So that's nonsense. Yes, but Susie, I think her question can be answered fairly easily just by saying that it's been amazing. It's been amazing working with you ladies. I think it's opened my eyes to a lot of science that I wouldn't have necessarily seen, and I think it's made me question everything that I got handed down. And I think we probably all need to do a little bit more of that.
More questions. I'm sure there are more questions. David. Yeah. I'm bringing you the microphone.
Yeah, I'm a historical researcher here, and doing the blog, and got like a title for my blog. It's called Mary Shelley and the Mother of Cyberpunk. And the reason why I say that is that when I looked at her biography and looked at the story she wrote as the first science fiction, she was also a mother as well, who had to deal with infant mortality as well. In my research, I found that in 2017, they had created the first artificial womb. Now, when I started to think about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I realized that she was the first science fiction author to actually be concerned about how technology could take over the role of motherhood and how it could be a threat to women's role as bearers of life. Today, we've seen what's happened in America, where Clarence Summers has basically removed the ability for women to be able to have autonomy over their, whether they can have a family. And locally, when I went to my local GP, I noticed that there was not advertisements, but like talking to women who were having babies in their 50s. Right. From what I've just said, how do you think the future of motherhood will turn out for humanity in 100 years, with all these issues around technology replacing women's ability to become autonomous, taking an autonomous role in planning families? And do you think that what's happened in America, is it an aberration of humanity? And what do you see as the trend historically about women's role as bearers of children, as heads of families and households? Sorry, just a second. And because of the technology, is women being able to have children at later ages an evolutionary trend?
I mean, I think this is exactly the question that a lot of people are asking, and I don't think everyone has the answer. So I think the really fascinating thing that you sort of have caught on there is the ability of technology to sort of change different women's ability to have children, or to, or that this could be limited. And I think this is part of the exact same phenomenon where those who have more capital, those who have more can get more out of the system. They are able to invest more in their children, whether that be in, in some distant future where all children are sort of purchased in lab-grown, units, which sounds amazing and like it would be a great idea. Because I'm very, very pregnant right now. But I think it's very true, and we can actually kind of see this, that, there are reproductive technologies. So my daughter was born because of IVF, because I'm very aged. But, that I was able to invest in that, which gives me a very different experience than someone who's not able to put, the money down to try and have children. And this is already happening. And of course, the people who are able to reproduce have probably been invested in turn. They've either had the secure jobs and felt able to, go ahead and choose to have children, or they haven't had the right to choose at all because they live in places where that's not afforded to them. So I think that all of these future questions are all dependent on the basic human question of how do we allow people to invest? How do we invest in people? How do we choose what the haves and the have-nots share and what they don't get to share? And I think that it is very worrying to think that children could be one of the things that becomes something that's, you have to be one of the haves to really have. Of course, we hope that's not the case. I hope that's not the case. But I think it is very worth paying attention to all of the legislative and the sort of social things and things we're willing to vote for and pay for. We used to say that what use was it sending a miner's kid to school? What use is it sending a poor kid to school? And it was churches like these that set up free schools for, local kids. And then suddenly we all think, yeah, 10-year-olds should go to school. Anyone with a 10-year-old definitely thinks a 10-year-old should go to school. But, and we did not think that way 150 years ago. My grandma finished school at 16, and it was like, wow, well done, Grandma. That is a long time. For my family background, 16 was pretty amazing. And I finished school at 32. So, it's like I got 15 extra years there. And that's because, me and Sally Mae, the student loan company in America, invested in me. So, I think that is really something is fascinating, but it's going to be a social decision which way that goes.
Thank you. Amazing talk, so thanks for that. I have a question, and I guess it was spurred sort of by the idea of investing and being invested in, and it's sort of a visual Venn diagram in a way. So it's kind of growing up, and then the points meet and you're grown, but then what about, where does the overlap with growing old? And I think you mentioned grandparents as well in your book, though I haven't read it, obviously, but so what's the overlap that you see between growing up and then growing old in terms of being invested in? Because once you get old, you start to be invested in by the grown people, if that makes sense?
Yes, though, of course, humans have found something better to do with old people than care for them. They make them care for their children. So this is another fascinating thing. Us in Wales, so Wales again, whales have grandmothers. No other species turns off reproduction in its adult female, because how else would you get more babies? But we've decided that we need to invest more. And I think that sort of cycle of investment, so we not only sort of have our children invested in by their direct parents, but we have all of our social buddies, which is a huge part of being a social animal, but also we have these extra people who don't have children of their own to invest in. So we've already hyped the investment cycle. And then towards the end, presumably we have made such healthy, wonderful babies that they actually do grow up to get old. And I mean, we have evidence of people being cared for before our species, of people who have injuries and things that wouldn't necessarily be easily survivable. So it's got to, that caring for sort of that final bit of the Venn diagram has got to have been in existence. I'm going to forget the Neanderthal evidence. You can remind me of...
Quite old ones, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't even know how prevalent it is as an idea anymore that sort of everybody died at 30 in the Ice Age, that I don't really think that's correct. I think there are some ethnographic cultures and stuff where you have like really quite low life expectancies, but that tends to be from birth. Whereas what we see from the archaeological remains is that easily 40 plus, 45, 50, it gets very hard after a while with the teeth. You can't really tell much once they're so worn down, but clearly they have survived a lot because they've got all sorts of long life injuries, arthritis and things like this. So yeah, certainly there is an older generation, and I think if we assume that first children are happening at least as older teenagers, like 18, 20 maybe, then you can easily have grandparents existing. I think that's probably, we should assume it for sure.
Whether their children are nice to them. The archaeological record does not necessarily tell. I think there are certainly by the time you get into the sort of Upper Pal and stuff, there are considerably older individuals who would have had to be helped around. And my favorite is always the old lady from the cave in Israel that I cannot pronounce. But she's sort of got one of her arms is messed up, and she's buried with thousands and thousands of tortoises. Just thousands. Just like, if you think of a number of tortoises that it would be acceptable to be buried with, like triple that. It is just too many tortoises. It is insane. Anyway, it's a fascinating burial. But someone who, 15,000 years ago, obviously was an important and cared for member of society who would not have been actively hunting or doing whatever it was they were doing in, I cannot say it, Hilachon. Oh, sorry. I apologize to the site. But, yeah. I don't know. We'll find out about the growing old book will come in. Yeah. Be a retirement project. Yeah. Yeah.
Whilst the mic's going over there, I'd like you all to start thinking about your best Brenna anecdote.
God no. I'd like to remind you, you're in a church. It's a Unitarian one, but.
So I went to a talk, a few months ago by someone called Lucy Cook, who just written a book called Bitch, all about sexual selection. And she said exactly the same thing as you were saying about how so much of it was male biologists. I don't even know what her field is. I can't keep them apart. But, basically just completely discounting the role of female sex selection and matriarchal animal societies. So what do you think are like the biggest consequences of the fact that we've had this very male view of anthropology, evolution, the animal kingdom? Like, what has it meant for how a society kind of conducts itself?
I mean, I think it's missed half of cultural evolution. Like, I think there is a really, really big sort of issue where the focus has been on male strategies, and females also have strategies, and we're still not very good at understanding them. So we talk about things like concealed ovulation. So most primates, you can tell when they're fertile. Us, who knows? And this is a very weird thing, and there are 5 or 6 theories as to why this is, and people actually haven't decided which one they sort of come down on the side of. Or things like, I think infanticide is another one of these things. So things that affect children, childhood, early socialization, they're just not quite considered to be important or of interest, and they receive less attention. I think they do get attention now. I think primatology is still quite male, but it's getting better. But there's just a series of questions that were never asked, and it's like, oh yeah, no, I guess if you're a chimpanzee, you wouldn't really want people fighting to the death over you all the time. That would be annoying. And that, there would be all of these, social coalitions they make and things that are actually quite important, but we just never bothered to ask. Like the whole thing about who learns to hunt with a spear in female chimpanzees. It's like, oh yeah, like I feel like females inventing weapons in a different primate species is interesting. Because we seem to have some quite androcentric ideas in our own species. So it's just like what questions we even ask are just so mutated that I think we've probably missed about half of the stuff that makes us human, or whatever weird primate we are.
Just wanted to interject because there's a really nice throwaway line, like quite in the beginning of Brenna's book. You may miss it if you aren't paying attention. But it's a really good question, talking about this idea of dimorphisms, the size differences between males and females, or size and shape, but often just limited down to size in most people's brains. And Brenna just says, you know, people talk about the males being larger, but maybe actually the reason is that females are smaller. And it's just how you phrase your questions. It flips on its head the way you go about researching them. If you want to try and understand why something is bigger, you look for different reasons and trying to understand it, well, maybe they came from a place of equality of size, and then something caused one sex to become smaller rather than one sex becoming larger. You flip it on its head, and it's a whole different question. And I don't think anyone's answered that question, Brenna. It's your next grant.
I believe people are working on it. Well, because mammals get it wrong. So mammals are super weird. But mammals are backwards. So in all other animals, females are bigger because they have to produce they're large, and females, let's just call them large gamete people, you know, and then there's small gamete people. Those are the two types of thing that exist in the world, large gametes and small gametes. And then everything else is sort of fun and choice. But the hyena, the females are bigger, but almost all other mammals, the females are smaller, or rather, the males are bigger. And I think actually one of the reasons that people point out is because female mammals have to devote so much energy to reproduction that they just sort of like, no, stop, all right, all the energy is going to go here to providing lovely, lovely fat for the babies. And then, you know, the guys are just slow to catch up and like, oh, did we stop? That's probably not an actual evolutionary theory. Don't take that to the funding council, please. You will not get an EU grant for that, probably. If you do, let me know. Oh dear,
Hi.
Sophie works at the zoo, so it's going to be a primate question. I'm terrified.
It's not a primate question. It's a question about murder. Because there's clearly so much investment in creating humans from the society who have the babies. And what's the relationship between that and how common throughout history in human societies conflict and killing each other is? And I thought of it because you mentioned crows and how they have a longer childhood because they're murderous. And is that right? And is there a relationship between the conflict that we inflict on ourselves and how much investment it takes to grow one, and why there isn't kind of greater sanctity of life?
See, I think that's actually fascinating. So crows don't usually kill each other in the crow-on-crow fights. So crows, they sort of exclude rather than direct murder. My bird expert's over there in the corner, so you can correct me later on crow behavior. But I think one of the things that people have suggested is the cause of our strange little human mating system is monogamy, is caused by infanticide. It's basically, it is a strategy against having rogue males who show up. And this is a very old-fashioned theory. It is not necessarily true, but it has been the sort of long-standing theory. So that we are actually primed to prevent one type of violence. But in terms of social violence, I mean, I'm not sure where you would lay the blame for that. We do invest hugely in our offspring, but we also have a lot of them. There are a lot of us. We are a very successful primate. There's a couple 100,000 of the other guys. It's like, and then there's us, billions. But I'm not sure. I think it's actually a really interesting question. I don't know, you know, it doesn't make any sense to me why you would invest that much and then send them off to go, you know, raid some nearby village and get smushed. We don't see the evidence of really, really large-scale violence. By really large scale, I don't mean large. I mean, like, I'm going to come smash your whole village and kill everyone. Until arguably kind of around the Neolithic. I don't think there's any particular, I think there is examples of Neanderthal violence. I think there's one spear stuck in someo's back.
Yeah, There's some hunting and gathering, foraging, community violence, but that's about 13,000 years, and that's probably to do with environmental stress. So that's like, but that's raiding. That's kind of like groups going in over long periods, but not like totally trashing whole villages.
Yeah, it takes until like Talheim. When is Talheim? Bronze Age, but it's like 5,000 years or something, like 3,000 years. I'm terrible at the European Bronze Age. It went on for a long time. Yeah. But you know, that's when you start to get an entire community wiped out. That's really like, there's one example that's in North Africa that may be about 10,000, 12,000 years of an entire community that's killed. But it doesn't happen until much, much later, until we are an incredibly numerous species all over the shop. We are no longer able to walk away from other people by the time we start killing our neighbors. So I think there are probably really interesting questions about that level of investment, but it goes right back into who gets invested in, who doesn't, and if that kid deserves your investment, or if this kid does, or if you don't care and you're happy to sort of smash their head with a stone axe and take their farmland. Happy thoughts. Yeah. Let's have a happy question.
It's just thinking of your Chimps Are Bastards file and that thing of Jane Goodall keeping her son Grub in a cage, because otherwise the chimps that she was studying would just eat him. A softball question. Have you seen the film Babies? It's just lovely. It's about 10 years old, and they follow 6 children from 0 to about 5 or 6, but one's growing up swaddled in Mongolia, just surrounded by grass. One's in Namibia, I think. One's in Germany, one's in Japan, in urban settings. And it's a little old, but it's beautiful.
I didn't know about that. No, I'll have to search this out. Yeah, I think that was one of the most fun bits of doing this book, actually, was going around and reading about sort of the various different ways that people raise their children. And I still have a lullaby that someone wrote down on a Mesopotamian sort of clay cuneiform tablet, stuck in my head. And it's just basically this, you know, and it's supposed to probably be sung, and it's probably from an older oral tradition, but it's just this sort of, little one who dwelt in the house of darkness for 10 months. Why are you crying? It goes on. But it's just really remarkable that, you know, from the very origins of kind of how we can trace history, it seems so familiar. And I think that's probably one of the most fun things that I sort of liked about the book. I thought it would help raising a kid. I'm not sure it would. I mean, buy the book anyway, just in case. It's very evolutionary informed.
And on that note, Brenna is available to sign your purchase copies in the back room, where there's also free booze.
Yes, and come support Viv and Bob from Newington Books, because they've come all the way out here with lots of books to buy, and they've got Becky's as well. So, come back. And thank you, everyone, for coming to church on a Monday night.